Freedom is slavery. War is peace. Ignorance is strength. When we hear these words in real life, we either don't take them seriously or think the person saying them has mental health issues. However, in the book 1984, these words are written on the streets and buildings of this universe and are spoken on the radio. Moreover, the people there don't even find this phrase strange. On the contrary, they accept it. George Orwell's famous book 1984, which describes a pitch-dark world to us, is one of the best examples of the dystopian genre, known as lystopia. Orwell, who was also a journalist, observed the ideologies of communism, socialism, and fascism that gained prominence in his time and created a compelling and thought-provoking story. The historical background of the book makes it both realistic and terrifying. Even today, we can see a similar chilling political system as described in this book. The fear that grips the reader while reading, and most importantly, makes them question, gives this book immense depth. And the subject of this video is the philosophy of the book 1984. The book introduces us to a dystopia where a one-party regime rules with a dictatorship. The party in the government oppresses its people using every possible method. For instance, they place cameras, called telescreens, in buildings, streets, and even people's homes to observe what they do every second. Everywhere there are posters of a figure called Big Brother, said to be the head of the party, and under these posters is written, "Big Brother is watching you." In this regime, not only what people say, but also what they think is scrutinized. The government has created a concept called thought crime, which is designed to punish thoughts against the government's ideas, considered the most severe crime. Additionally, a language called newspeak is used in this dystopia. In newspeak, some words that the government does not want are removed, and the government publishes a dictionary for this language, and using words not in the dictionary in daily life is prohibited. Amid all this oppression, we meet our main character, Winston, a low-ranking member of the party. Winston is fed up with the oppressive regime he is subjected to and gradually begins to break the rules imposed by the government. During this process, we witness his secret relationship with a woman named Julia, his being trapped by a high-ranking member named O'Brien, and his gradual loss of the spirit of resistance due to betrayals and torture. The first part we should focus on in this book is the propaganda technique skillfully applied by this regime. At the very beginning of the book, a question arises in our minds. How do the people here not rebel against such an oppressive government? The fact that these people do not rebel, even passionately side with the government, shows us that the government successfully applies certain manipulation techniques. So, perhaps we should ask this question: how do you bring people to your side? One of the government's answers to this question is to make people hate the other side. The government organizes a ceremony called Hate Week every year, where people gather and spew their hatred towards the enemy, symbolized by a figure, with great passion. Additionally, the government introduces new enemies during this event. Besides this, there is a daily routine called the 2 minutes hate, where people express their hatred towards the current enemies and show their love for Big Brother. Even someone like Winston, who does not support the government and does not hate Goldstein, finds it impossible to avoid participating in this mob psychology. In the book, Winston explains this situation as follows. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. While these hate rituals described in the book may seem unusual at first, such hate speech targeting enemies is a method frequently resorted to by oppressive regimes. Let's examine the policies of the Soviet Union, which inspired Orwell to write this book. Joseph Stalin, who led the Soviet Union for a period, created a crime called enemy of the people and sent those who opposed his regime to concentration camps. With this method, Stalin created a perception of enemies within the people, directing their hatred and anger towards a specific group. By creating a perception of an enemy even in the minds of those who were not staunch supporters, he succeeded in bringing people to his side with the approach of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." Returning to the book, we see that this government, similar to Stalin's policy of hatred and enemy, also runs a powerful propaganda campaign in other ways. Sociologist Jacques Ellul published an article on the psychology of propaganda in 1931, approximately 17 years before this book was written. And in this article, he listed 4 essential points for perfect propaganda. These points are: 1. Highlight emotions. Do not engage in debate. 2. Frame the propaganda in the form of us versus the enemy. 3. Target groups as well as individuals. 4. Hide the propagandist as much as possible. Returning to the 1984 universe, we see the party skillfully applying these points while doing propaganda. Let's take the first point. Highlight emotions. Do not engage in debate. In the government's Hate Week or 2 minutes hate presentations, we can see that they completely target the emotions of the people there. Instead of arguments like why the other side is the enemy, why we are the good side, or what we are fighting for, a presentation is made accompanied by enthusiastic music and cheers, where emotions are at the forefront. The purpose of the presentation is not to explain an idea to people, but to incite them. Focusing on the second point, frame the propaganda in the form of us versus the enemy. This government always has an enemy and is always at war. In fact, this government knows that to keep the people on its side, it must always have an enemy and be in a war. Because if you deprive the people of this background of war and enemy, the suppressed anger and hatred of the people will turn towards the government itself. Therefore, there is always a struggle with an enemy, always a division of us and the enemies. We see that the third point of targeting groups as well as individuals is successfully applied. Hate Week or 2 minutes. Hate events are held publicly, and if these presentations were made individually instead of in groups, for example, if Winston was alone in these events, it would be much harder for him to express his hatred. But as mentioned, a person, even if they do not support the government's policy, is caught up in mob psychology during these mass hate events and cannot help but participate with hatred. The government skillfully applies the fourth point of hiding the propagandist as much as possible. The leader of the government, the mysterious figure called Big Brother, who is behind the propaganda, is never seen throughout the story. He exists only in posters and screens, never appearing in person. He is hidden as much as possible. Analyzing the party's propaganda, we see that they have a very effective method. However, this propaganda technique still does not fully bring characters like Winston to the party's side, and the party resorts to other methods. As mentioned, there is a concept called thought crime in this government. If a person has anti-government thoughts and expresses them, they are severely punished. However, the government has a much more cunning method than thought crime, which is to reduce the capacity of people to think, preventing them from even committing thought crime. And they do this with language. In newspeak, the language used by the government, the use of certain words deemed inappropriate by the party is prohibited. We can see that this policy is highly functional. The language we use and the words it contains are crucial for our thoughts. Because when a person tries to convey an idea to another or even form a thought in their mind, they formulate this idea with words. But if using the words to express that idea is prohibited, it will be just as hard for that idea to exist in a person's mind. Knowing this, the government prohibits these words, preventing anti-government ideas from not only being expressed, but even forming. For example, let's take the word dictator and imagine it is removed from the Newspeak dictionary, along with other words that could replace it. In this case, even if a person holds the idea that Big Brother is a dictator, they will not be able to express it to others because the necessary words will not be available. Moreover, the person trying to form this thought will gradually forget what the word dictator means, making it increasingly difficult for such a thought to form in their mind. By banning these words, the government not only prevents anti-government ideas from being expressed, but also stops these ideas from forming. Another method the government uses to control people's minds is manipulating the past. This government distorts past information, changes it according to its interests, and rewrites history. They portray the situation before the current regime as a disaster, making people grateful for the current regime. They create imaginary people and present them as heroes, showing that they have a powerful history. Winston, by straining his memory, senses that the party has distorted past information. But since the government has eliminated every document and photo about the past, a person even starts doubting their memory. The party's control over the past is one of its most powerful tools for controlling the people. Because the party that controls the past can justify all its actions. It designs the past in such a way that the oppression and tyranny of the current regime seem like a necessity, even a blessing, compared to the past. However, the most famous metaphor of the government's mind control methods is the frequent reference to 2 + 2 = 5. When O'Brien captures Winston and tries to brainwash him, he tries to make Winston believe that 2 + 2 = 5, or more precisely, that 2 + 2 is whatever the party says it is. Orwell did not randomly choose this equation. This equation has a metaphorical value. For example, the Soviet Union aimed to complete its 5-year development plan in 4 years and chose this equation as their slogan. However, The real reference in this equation is directed at the mentality of the Nazis. Hermann Göring, who led the Nazi army, famously expressed his loyalty to Adolf Hitler by saying, "If the Führer wants it, 2 plus 2 makes 5. In an article Orwell prepared before this book, he wrote the following about the Nazis' manipulation of reality. Nazi theory indeed specifically denies that such a thing as the truth exists. The implied objective of this line of thought is a nightmare world in which the leader, or some ruling clique, controls not only the future but the past. If the leader says of such an event, it never happened, well, it never happened. If he says that 2 and 2 are 5, well, 2 and 2 are 5. This prospect frightens me much more than bombs. To summarize what I have explained so far, the government in the book successfully applies 2 fundamental methods to brainwash the people. One is the propaganda technique that instills hate and enmity, and the other is mind control through methods like newspeak and manipulating the past. However, despite all their efforts, the government still cannot completely turn someone like Winston to their side. And this time they resort to a primitive, ruthless, and equally effective method, the fear factor. There is a concept in this book designed by Orwell, inspired by philosopher Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon. Bentham designed the panopticon to keep prisoners under control. In this design, prison cells are arranged in a circular manner with a watchtower in the center. A guard in the watchtower can see every prisoner. According to Bentham, this design makes prisoners aware that they might be watched at any moment, thereby regulating their behavior, even though it's impossible for a guard to watch all the prisoners at the same time. The mere possibility of being watched makes prisoners refrain from any wrong actions. The government in the book applies a similar surveillance mechanism with telescreens placed everywhere. Although it's impossible to monitor all people with telescreens at the same time, the paranoia of being watched prevents people from engaging in anti-government activities. The government takes the concept further, turning people into walking telescreens. People observe others and report any anti-government behavior they notice. This situation was also seen in the Soviet Union under Stalin, where citizens were encouraged to report any anti-government actions without hesitation, even if it meant betraying friends, neighbors, or family members. In the book, a similar situation is seen with the character Parsons, whose daughter reports him to the government for thought crime. Turning back to Winston, the person who led him into the hands of the government was Charrington, who initially appeared to be trustworthy. This leads to the harshest part of the story, where O'Brien subjects Winston to various tortures and manipulations, trying to make him love Big Brother and believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5, or more precisely, that it equals whatever the party wants it to be. Although Winston eventually gives in due to the severe pain and accepts O'Brien's assertions, O'Brien realizes that Winston's spirit of resistance is still not completely broken. Therefore, he decides to subject Winston to the infamous Room 101. In Room 101, Winston is threatened with a torture involving rats eating his face. At this point, Winston breaks down completely, pleading for the torture to be done to Julia instead of himself. This proves the saying in the book that pain alone causes the desire for it to stop. There is nothing worse than physical pain in the world. There is no hero in the face of pain. By the end of the book, the government has successfully turned Winston into what they wanted. He starts to feel a sense of belonging to the government, replacing his hatred for Big Brother with love, and finally accepting that 2 plus 2 equals 5. The book 1984 is not just a criticism of socialism, communism, or fascism. It fundamentally criticizes totalitarian regimes, regardless of the ideology, whether communism or fascism, that in practice becomes oppressive, restricting rights and freedoms. It warns that if such a regime gains power, it will lead to a point of no return where people won't even realize that their minds are controlled and that they have lost their freedom of thought. Looking at the end of the book, one might think Orwell ends on a pessimistic note. Winston loses, and the government successfully transforms him into what they want. However, this transformation required the government to expend all its resources. Winston was monitored with telescreens, spent hours with one of the party's smartest members, O'Brien, and finally broke in Room 101. From this, we can infer that the government had to exert tremendous effort and resources to break just one person. If there were more people like Winston, who weren't afraid to think and question, the government would not be able to make 2 plus 2 equal 5, nor would they have the power to change it. Please show your support by subscribing to this channel.